was 10 o'clock in the morning. George Kogan was coming back to the apartment he shared with his sweetheart. They were going to do a late brunch. He never saw it coming. The doorman of the building was the first to rush to the fallen George Kogan's side.
Help me, please.
He called 911, and George was rushed to New York Hospital. And investigators scoured the sidewalks for clues at the scene.
It was very hard due to the fact that physical evidence was limited.
There were 2 bloody bags of groceries and a crushed bullet, deformed, they would call it. It had passed through George's body, entering his back and exiting his chest.
We were able to tell what weapon was used by the size of the slug. It was a .44 caliber revolver. Now, a .44 is a big gun. It's a big caliber bullet. Ever see Dirty Harry? That's the gun.
Thank you.
I don't think he would use a .44 caliber handgun for any other reason except to kill somebody.
Clearly somebody wanted George Kogan dead very badly. The question now became, who?
The first person that the detectives talked to was the doorman.
Can you tell us what you saw?
He's the one who called 911. They were hoping that maybe George had said something to him before he was rushed away in the ambulance.
But he claimed he did not see the shooting. He heard the shots.
His first belief was, oh, must be a backfire of a car or construction. Anything but a gun being fired in broad daylight on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Some neighborhoods in New York City are used to the sounds of gunfire. That is not true for Manhattan's Upper East Side.
If it's happening here, it's happening all over, because this is probably the safest neighborhood in the city.
The Upper East Side was originally known as the Silk Stocking District.
Beautiful townhouses, very expensive stores. You know, the stereotype of well-dressed ladies walking around with poodles is not an exaggeration.
There's doormans in every building, cabs dropping people off at all hours of the day. So, I mean, just on that block alone where the shooting happened, literally thousands of people live there. So it's not the best place to try and commit a murder.
Investigators canvassed the rest of the neighborhood to see if anyone saw the shooting.
I heard these shots and I heard this man exclaiming, "Oh my God, save me, you know." So I opened the window and I saw his body laying right there.
Detective Fornabayo? Can you tell us what you saw?
There was a woman that was getting in her car at the time and did see the individual coming behind George.
A witness said she saw a man in a green hat, plaid shirt, in his 30s, point a gun and fire 3 times into George's back. Then the suspect calmly walked away like they were going to meet somebody for lunch.
She was not close enough to see this gunman's face. Perhaps the one person who was close enough was George.
I had detectives respond to the hospital to possibly interview George, but that was unsuccessful.
The doctors came out of the operating room and told his living girlfriend, Mary Louise, that George had died.
Mary Louise was hysterical. They had a very close romantic relationship. They loved each other.
She was the closest person to him. She was living with him. So obviously she would be someone to be interviewed.
But Mary Louise was too hysterical to say much of anything. So investigators eventually let Mary Louise go home to her family in Long Island, as she was far too distraught and reluctant a witness at that point.
Won't do something like this. Is there anybody that you can think of?
But it wasn't a complete loss.
They found out there might have been a person who had a beef with George.
Mary Louise was dating a psychiatrist when George turned her head.
There have been lots of ex-boyfriends who killed their girlfriend or wife's new lover.
Was this psychiatrist intent on killing the man who'd stolen her away from him?
"24 hours in, police had their eyes on a new person of interest in George Kogan's murder, Mary Louise's ex-boyfriend, a psychiatrist on the Upper East Side.
Police wanted to see if Mary Louise's ex-boyfriend might have been jealous and decided to kill his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend.
So investigators went to speak with the psychiatrist.
Can you tell us how you heard about George's death?
Well, we're questioning an individual. First thing we look at is their body language and their physical emotions as to the response to our questions. You could tell right away if they're tense and afraid to answer any of the questions.
Can you tell us where you were on October 23rd?
It was a work day for me, so I would have come home about 5 o'clock. My girlfriend picked me up.
He explained that he had moved on amicably, was dating somebody else, had no animus toward George Kogan.
After talking to the ex-boyfriend, police believed his story. He was living with a new woman, he seemed happy, and he was not a person who was going to gain anything financially. So police decided to do a background check on George, and got a surprise.
Investigators knew that George had a girlfriend, but they also found out George had a wife.
George's marriage certificate.
And her name was Barbara Kogan.
Interesting.
So when investigators saw that, it certainly raised eyebrows.
I think we should talk to Barbara, ask her some questions. So, Mrs. Kogan, we got the visitation records from the hospital, and I'm curious as to why you never went to visit George at the hospital.
I couldn't bear to see him like that. It's my
Barbara Kogan explained she was falling apart at home, sobbing, screaming, and when she had heard her husband was shot, she was afraid to go out in public.
But I was scared.
She did not know who shot George, and she didn't know if the shooter also wanted to kill her. So she said she did not go to the hospital for security reasons.
So you feared for your own safety?
Yes. It's my husband and we were together 30 years. I loved him.
After talking to her, she did not give them any reason to think, that she did this. There was nothing linking her to the murder.
She talked to them about when she and George met and fell for each other. George grew up in Puerto Rico, and he was from a wealthy real estate holding family.
George's family in Puerto Rico was just a tight-knit, supportive group of people who loved each other. And it was a big Jewish family, with lots of parties, and they all supported each other. They helped each other. They worked together in the Kogan business. George was raised to take over the family business.
He came to New York in the 50s to go to NYU. There, during his college years, was where he met Barbara Kogan. She was a student at Barnard at the time, and they fell in love. Before you could say, I do, he had grabbed her up and brought her to Puerto Rico, where he lived a luxurious life. She did too, as his wife. She turned out to have a great head for business. They ran their department store chain and their casino resort out in San Juan together and were, by all accounts, a great match.
George was a charmer, and she was enamored with him as much as he was with her. They traveled a lot. They hobnobbed with the wealthy. She became a socialite in San Juan. She was always on the society pages. They were a big deal, and the Kogan name was well known in Puerto Rico.
They had 2 boys, and they raised their 2 sons in Puerto Rico.
He was caring. He liked kids, and he was good with children. He was a good father.
After their sons were old enough to go to college, they decided to move back to New York on the Upper East Side.
New York was where they fell in love. I'm sure they had fond feelings for the city. And in 1986, Barbara and George got a very fancy apartment on Fifth Avenue. They opened up an antiques gallery and went into business selling antiques and managing the properties that they still owned.
Looks great.
Yeah.
This stuff is gonna go quick.
Yeah, I hope.
They both were excited to move to New York, and they both were excited to get a business going and thought it would be successful.
So what are you working on? On the ledger?
Well, yeah, sales have.
Neither one of them were experienced in owning an antique store. It's one thing to buy antiques, it's another thing to sell them, and that was not their forte.
Kids are gone, empty nesters, and they're looking at each other. And so they pour their heart and souls into this store that doesn't take off.
Because the antique store was not doing well, so they hired a public relations person.
Oh, hi! Louise, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so happy to be here. And we need you. It's a beautiful collection. Thank you. I can give you a tour. So please, yes. Okay, so this is Crystal from... Yes, from France. Hello.
I'm George.
Mary Louise.
Hi.
So Mary Louise was attracted to George. He was a handsome and dynamic older man. She was a young woman from a well-to-do family. And so she found a connection.
So, let me give you the rest of the tour.
Well, nice meeting you.
Oh, it's nice to meet you too.
Hope to see you again.
Absolutely.
I don't know that George was looking for someone else, but it's almost like he and Barbara were so caught up in the business. They lost the relationship somewhere along the line.
And at some point, George and Mary Louise, they began having an affair. And 2 weeks in, George went to live with Mary Louise in her own apartment. So now George and Barbara were in the middle of a divorce proceeding.
Around that time, there were rumors flying around. The papers had been filed to make Mary Louise the sole beneficiary of his life insurance.
There was a 20-year difference on George and Mary Louise, which is a lot. She was used to a very expensive lifestyle. I think Mary Louise thought she had herself a sugar daddy.
Mrs. Kogan, we got the record.
Detectives now are wondering if Mary Louise could have hired somebody to kill George, and she would have gotten all that money, and Barbara would have made out with nothing.
Thank you for coming in.
When you look at how the murder took place, this was somebody coming up behind George, shooting him in the back, and then leaving the area. It was very cold-blooded, and it certainly looks like an out-and-out hit.
Hello.
I'm George.
Mary Louise.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Welcome.
Thank you.
George had been talking about making his girlfriend, Mary Louise, the beneficiary on his life insurance policy. And it was possible that she could have hired somebody to kill George for a substantial amount of money.
So investigators, of course, wanted to speak with Mary Louise.
Excuse me? I'm looking for Detective Fornabayo.
Mary Louise did not speak to police at first. She went home to her family in Long Island and, on their advice, got herself a lawyer.
Investigators then interviewed Mary Louise extensively about her relationship with George.
Can you tell me where you were when you heard George was shot?
Yes. I was in her apartment, and he just went out for a minute to go get some groceries, and it's not that far away, so I knew he would be back pretty soon. And then I heard the gunshots.
After a few minutes with her, one thing became very clear to the detectives.
Mary Louise's sadness was quite genuine, I believed.
I know how this looks, and I know he was very wealthy. I need you to know that it was never about money. I have money. I didn't need him for that. I just loved him.
Mary Louise also explained to police that George was in the process of making her a beneficiary on his life insurance, but he hadn't done that yet.
You weren't named as a beneficiary on...
And actually, Mary Louise stood to inherit nothing.
No, it was not.
Mary Louise had no apparent motive.
So while the police were doing their investigation, we were at the Post, we're also doing ours.
A millionaire being gunned down in broad daylight was a huge story.
Shot him 3 times in the back and ran away.
Makes you wonder, it's never safe really to walk around.
And it did wind up on the front page of the New York Post.
The location and the people involved, I think all was out there and obviously got a lot of attention from the public.
People have always been fascinated with rich people and their lives because their lives are so different than the mundane lives that most of us lead. So when they hear something like this, you would think a rich guy, he's got it all going for him, and then now he's shot lying in the middle of the street on the Upper East Side. People just can't get enough of those kind of stories.
So With all this chatter around New York City about what happened to George, of course, all the attention took a toll on George's family, especially his sons, who, on top of having to come to New York, take care of their grieving mother, deal with funeral arrangements, everyone in the tri-state area is gossiping about their family's pain, and they still haven't found their father's killer.
Mom, I brought some soup.
Barbara was lost. She didn't know what to do.
She was self-sedating. She was taking sleeping pills.
I'm hungry.
You gotta wake up. You have to eat something. You've been sleeping all day. Come on.
The boys had lost their father. And, he was really the rock that held the family together. And so I think the boys were saddled with not only their grief, but having to take care of their mother. And I think that they relied on each other.
We had nothing else to go on, and we wanted answers.
That's when the autopsy report came back.
Be back soon.
Take a look at that.
I'm gonna call you back. Hollow points.
Yep.
44.
Big gun.
Big gun.
George was shot with hollow point bullets. And those bullets, specifically when they enter the body, they spread out. Shrapnel goes all over the body, hitting numerous organs.
It's definitely a bullet that is used if you're trying to do the most damage to somebody.
What, you think this assassination?
A hollow point bullet would point to an underworld or mob hit. Those are signature ballistics for mob assassinations.
So police knew that Mary Louise had been hired to pump up business for the store.
Yes, and that's 24 karat gold on the rim.
But when they looked into why they needed a publicist, they discovered it was for a very specific reason.
You, sit still. Hey, you! Get up! You, stay calm. It's okay. It's okay.
Several months before, there was a robbery in the store.
Just don't hurt anybody. Just don't hurt anybody.
A robbery on the Upper East Side, it's not a common crime.
After the robbery, people were scared. The business started to fail. Part of that had to do with all the rumors flying around that there was a chance that Barbara and George's store may have been targeted, and that could have pointed to something darker.
What are you waiting for? Call the police!
Well, based on the interview with Mary Louise and going through his personal papers, we found that George had associations with people in Puerto Rico, and some of them may not have been exactly legal.
You're fine. Everyone's okay. Oh my God. I don't believe this just happened.
So then we find out George Kogan, his hotel in Puerto Rico, was sold for a total of $11 million. On that sale, George Kogan was only paid $2 million. So there was an individual that still owed him $9 million.
That man's name was Avron Torres.
And the person that bought the hotel from him might have had ties with the Russian mob.
So police now were wondering if this was a mob hit.
Maybe this individual who bought the hotel didn't want to pay the $9 million remaining, and the debt would have been washed.
The mafia in Manhattan is notoriously violent and wouldn't hesitate to collect a debt at the end of a gun.
Hello? So detectives now are wondering if George made a business deal with the wrong person.
We worked something out.
And if that deal cost him his life.
In the days after his murder, police thought that there might be a few skeletons in George Kogan's closet. The style of his killing, the bullets that had been pumped into his back pointed to organized crime, plus a man owed him $9 million. And that man reportedly had ties to the Russian mafia.
So they started to look into George's financial situation. And they found out that George was worth a lot less than people had thought.
Investigators found that he was worth what in the Upper East Side is a comparative pittance, a mere $2 million.
I mean, $2 million is a lot of money, but he walked around like he had 5 times that.
He was wearing designer labels like Gucci and Dolce & Gabbana. He was renting a fancy luxury apartment on Fifth Avenue, but the money in his bank account didn't reflect any of that. And George hid this from everyone.
So one thing that they looked at to see is if George was maybe putting pressure on this person with the Russian mob connections, and if he in turn just said, I'm tired of this guy and I don't kill.
Hello?
So detectives reached out to this person.
Mr. Torres?
Yes, this is Abran.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about George Kogan.
What's this in regards to, detective?
About how much money do you owe George?
And he explained to them that he was going to pay George.
We worked something out.
In fact, he even had worked out a payment plan where he was paying him.
And we'll let you know if we need anything else.
Everything was on paper. There was a paper trail about the transaction. It was documented that he still owed him all this money.
They had collateral set up. They had all sorts of things set up. That would lead right back to this guy. If he did something like this, you're gonna know right away he was the one involved with this thing.
There was no suspect yet, okay? There was no motive determined yet. And now people, they were talking about George's sordid past, this love triangle.
There was a lot of chatter on the Upper East Side.
Barbara, she got dumped for a younger woman, so she could not be happy about that. The Post, we were writing the most about her. We couldn't get enough of the story, so we were writing about her every day, and some of the stories were not making her look good. So I guess she just figured, look, you gotta fight this, go fight with the person who's writing about you. So she decided to do a front page interview with the New York Post to give her side of the story.
The Kogans were the type of family who certainly wanted to be on the gossip pages. Barbara Kogan is definitely that woman, but she didn't want to be in the paper for this.
And I just lost my husband 30 years.
One of the reasons Barbara Kogan probably decided to talk to the Post is so that she could have direct communication with her neighbors, because that's who's reading the New York Post every single day.
A lot of people are talking about the affair.
I'm not the kind of person to hold on to anything.
She said that she forgave Mary Louise. There were no hard feelings, and she just wanted privacy. She wanted to be able to grieve with her sons.
The day after Barbara did an interview with the Post was the funeral for George.
It was a huge, grand affair, typical of someone who lived on the Upper East Side and was a part of New York City society.
It was a media circus. So everybody was there, photographers taking pictures of Barbara coming in and out, everybody trying to stick a microphone in her face to get a few words. But Barbara wouldn't talk. She was crying. She had to be helped in and out of the service. She really just wanted her time to grieve. The funeral was a well-attended event. There were a lot of people there. George was a well-liked person. He was very gregarious, outgoing, friendly. He had a lot of friends. I mean, all this other stuff coming out about his business dealings, that was not known by most of the people who knew George. They just knew him as this lovable, likable guy.
And now the man who was the glue who kept the Kogan family together was gone. It was quite a sad chapter in their lives that they couldn't yet close until someone was brought to justice.
We wanted answers, but we didn't have much to go on, and we really didn't have any suspects lined up. It was very frustrating.
Until a few weeks later, when Barbara Kogan, as his sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy, received $4.3 million. That was far more than she would have received in any settlement. In fact, it was twice his value alive.
There was nothing linking her to the murder, but something did not sit right with detectives. So they decided to subpoena her phone records.
And there was one particular call that really stood out.
Barbara called George's insurance company 5 days prior to the shooting. So we spoke to the insurance agent.
Thank you so much for your time.
Barbara was looking to see how much the policy was for and to see if she was still the beneficiary. So this raised police up a little bit. They were just about to sign the divorce papers, so why was she concerned about George's life insurance policy?
And what Barbara did with that money was pretty odd behavior for a woman in mourning.
She got rounds of plastic surgery. She went on trips. She lived high, high on the hog. There was a bit of retail therapy going on, it would seem.
After Barbara spent all the money, she was forced to file for bankruptcy. And at the bankruptcy hearing, her behavior just got even more bizarre.
Barbara Kogan began calling out that she was on the brink of suicide and telling everyone that they could just take her money and be executors of her estate. She wasn't going to be there anymore. Still, erratic behavior does not a murder case make.
Everything police had on Barbara at this point, the call to the insurance company, her strange spending habits, was all circumstantial.
You can't arrest somebody just on circumstantial evidence, and that didn't even amount to that.
Case went on for about 2 years and remained stagnant without any breaks. Until an individual was arrested in Westchester County for a bad check.
Well, there is something I want.
The man's name was Carlos Piavanetti.
So how about we cut ourselves a deal? Sound good?
He told investigators that he knew who hired the killer in the George Kogan case.
I got a name for you. You want to hear it? He just unloads it to me.
So when Carlos gave the name, investigators just looked at each other and said, "Who's that?"
Carlos, everyone is talking about this story that you're telling.
Carlos Piavanetti was facing 15 years, and he was trying to make a deal where he would not have to go to jail.
The unsolved murder on Upper East Side. I know who set up the hit.
That name was Matty Martinez. Carlos said that several months after the shooting, he met with Matty Martinez.
We go to this restaurant, we're talking, we're having a good time.
And during the course of that meeting, Matty Martinez confessed to Piavanetti that he was the intermediary in the murder of George Kogan.
He hired the guy. He set up the hit, he got the money.
But that wasn't all.
Martinez told Piavanetti that Barbara Kogan ordered that hit.
Manny Martinez had been Barbara Kogan's divorce lawyer down in Puerto Rico.
So it turned out that Manny did Barbara's Spanish language documents during the divorce, and like Barbara, he split his time between Puerto Rico and New York.
Take cream or sugar?
Black.
So the Westchester County Police immediately notified the Manhattan DA's office, and they went to work right away.
Investigators asked Carlos to set up a controlled call with Manny Martinez, get him talking about this hit.
Manny, how have you been?
Carlos basically played dumb.
I think you set up that thing with George, you know? Well, that's right, I remember.
Basically get him to repeat the whole story again.
But while Manny Martinez did say he was involved in a hit, he didn't name Barbara Kogan.
Hey, yeah.
Well, there was a name that he did mention, and that was the alleged hitman.
That's right, I remember. Yeah, they didn't call him that for nothing.
So they put in a subpoena for Manny Martinez phone records.
They found 14 phone calls between Manny Martinez and the hitman on the day of George Kogan's murder. The Post interviewed Manny Martinez. He was eager to speak to the paper about his legal troubles. And he flat out said, "I dare a grand jury to indict me." Prosecutors could now go to the other people in Manny Martinez's life and ask them, had he ever spoken about this hit? And indeed, they found he had.
So finally, the district attorney's office had what they felt was enough evidence, and they indicted Manny in 1995 for the murder of George Kogan. But there was a problem.
Just when the DA's office felt they'd had him, they found that he was unavailable. He was in Mexico City. He had been arrested on charges that he had defrauded a Mexican bank out of millions. Manny Martinez was facing 20 years in jail, and Mexican authorities refused to part with him until he had finished that sentence. Only then could he be extradited back to the U.S.
It was very frustrating waiting for this time to go by to bring him back to New York.
Police were having a hard time because at that point, they did not have enough to arrest Barbara.
There was nothing substantial that linked her to the crime.
Barbara said she didn't know Manny Martinez. She thought she was going to get away with it scot-free.
Finally, in 2007, they received a call that Manny was getting out of jail in Mexico, and they were ready. They brought Manny back to New York City and tried him for murder in the second degree.
Prosecutors put together a pretty airtight case.
It took a jury 3 days to find Martinez guilty of second-degree murder. Once Martinez was convicted, the case against Barbara looked a lot more promising.
At Manny's trial, many witnesses took the stand and said Manny always told them Barbara Kogan ordered the hit, and Barbara Kogan paid for the hit, and Barbara Kogan benefited from this hit.
At that time, Barbara was indicted.
And they charged her with murdering her husband, George Kogan, 17 years later.
That anger became so overwhelming that she and Mr. Martinez chose to litigate the divorce through the bullets of a gun rather than through the good offices of a court.
Barbara Kogan never went to trial. Instead, she chose to cry uncle and say, "You got me." She took a plea.
Detectives feel that the motive of this was for money, for greed.
There's a problem.
Somehow, Barbara and Manny figured out a few weeks before George's death that she was not going to make out as much financially as she thought.
This can't be right.
If George had lived, she would have only gotten $1 million instead of the $4.3 million that she got when he was killed.
He lied to me.
So they did a little quick math, and they figured out he was definitely worth more dead than alive.
What am I gonna do?
We called her the Black Widow because she dressed in black as if in grief for her husband. But the phrase Black Widow aptly describes the venom in this woman, a woman who could kill the father of her own children, take the money and live it up while her sons were grieving.
Must have been pure hell for George's sons. Their father died, and they had to see what their mother was really like.
It was awful for the boys. It was too tough for them to speak at the hearing.
Their mother was going to go away to jail for killing their beloved father. They were basically going to become orphans.
In taking the life of George Kogan, Barbara Kogan not only deprived Mary Louise of her sweetheart, but also an entire family of a really, really beloved man.
And it just shows you how money can drive people to insanity. I don't think there were any winners in this. I think everybody lost. The whole thing is it's just dark.
In the end, Mary Louise got justice, the sons got justice. The rest of the family, they saw justice, but it's a bitter pill.